I am Abigail Franklin, 31, and I walked into my brother's wedding expecting a handshake and a chair with my name on it. Instead, a stranger pressed a badge into my palm that called me an afterthought, and my own brother told security to move me along while the strings played like nothing was wrong. I did not cry, and I did not beg. I drove home, put the card in a drawer, and set my clock to business hours. By morning, paper would do what anger never could. If you have ever wondered how a woman answers a public insult without raising her voice, or what happens when contracts remember what people forget, come with me. I will show you how calm and a clear clause can turn one careless word into consequences timed to the minute. The only question is how far respect can be rebuilt once the math is done. I arrived at the Riverside Grand Hotel in Stamford, Connecticut, 25 minutes early, calm from the drive, and determined to do this one thing without ceremony. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and lilies. A string quartet floated in from the ballroom, not yet loud, just a warm hum under the murmur of guests. I followed the signs to the check-in table set outside the ballroom and gave my name to the young woman arranging lapel cards in neat rows. She looked down, plucked one from the A section, and pressed it into my palm. Afterthought. Thick black letters on bright white stock. My mind went very still. I have learned that stillness can be a shelter when people try to knock you off your feet. I asked her to check again the way a person might point out a smudge on glass. My tone was even. My hands did not shake. She glanced at the tablet, then up at me with that tight smile hotel staff learn early, the one that says, "I cannot help you, but I will try to look kind while I tell you so." Before she could speak, James stepped in from my right tuxedo. Perfect boutonniere, exactly pinned the air around him, moving the way it does when a man knows the room belongs to him. He said to the head of security that I was to be removed. He said it like an instruction he had given many times before. He did not look at the card in my hand. He did not look at my face long enough to recognize the girl who learned to set his place at the table straight and fold his collar flat when he was late for school. Tyrone Davis, head of security, was the kind of professional you find in a five-star hotel. Broad-shouldered, steady eyes, a voice measured to de-escalate even a storm. He did not grab my elbow. He did not raise his voice. He invited me to step into a quiet lounge off the lobby. He introduced himself, confirmed my name, and explained that he needed to draft and sign an incident report because a member of the host party had requested that I be escorted from the event area. He asked if I was safe to leave on my own. He wrote down the facts exactly as they had happened and slid the paper toward me so I could read it. His pen made a soft sound on the page. I signed where he had placed a small sticky tab. It is a strange comfort when order shows up in the same minute that dignity is being tested. My parents stood a little way off by a tall arrangement of roses and greenery, dressed as if they had been born for this kind of evening. Catherine was with them, hand on her phone, eyes fixed on a spot over my shoulder. None of them moved. Not toward me. Not toward the card in my hand. People always think cruelty is loud. Most of the time it is quiet. It is a choice not to take 3 steps in your direction when 3 steps would change everything. From the lounge I could see the ballroom doors open and close in a measured rhythm. Trays of champagne passed through. A flash of silver fabric, laughter that could have belonged to anyone. I slid the name tag into the side pocket of my purse. I did it gently, as if rough handling would make the word any truer than it already looked. The quartet turned a page, and the melody swelled. Somewhere a photographer called out for a group to gather in the archway. The night went on without me, as nights do. Tyrone walked with me to the curb. He did not hover. He simply made space around me so I could breathe. He told me the valet had my car at the front. He asked again if I felt safe to drive. I told him I did. He nodded and said that if I needed anything further, the front desk could contact him. Practical kindness is the only kind that makes sense in a moment like that. I thanked him. It cost me nothing, and it acknowledged that he had done his job with decency. The air outside was softer than I expected for a June evening. The sun had left a pink edge on the clouds, and the first lights along the driveway had come glowing to life. A couple in formal wear hurried past me, laughing at something that did not matter, and I realized that my hands were no longer cold. Hurt does that. It burns through the chill and leaves heat behind. I put my purse on the passenger seat and sat for a moment with both palms on the steering wheel. I am not a woman who theatrically vows revenge. I am a woman who likes paper to match the rules and clocks to match the workday. Clarity is a better blade than rage. Civility is a better shield than noise. I drove out past the fountain and turned toward Harbor Point, the streets familiar as the lines on my own hand. There was a grocery store on the corner where I had once bought lilacs for my mother. There was a coffee shop where I had watched James joke with a barista who did not know his name. Life leaves small markers to orient you when dignity gets knocked sideways. At a red light, I touched the pocket of my purse where the card rested, the edges square against my fingers. I did not need to look at it again. The word had done its work. It had sorted who I was to them from who I was to myself. When I reached my building, I parked and listened to the engine tick as it cooled. The quiet was a door I could walk through. I took the card from my purse, held it up to the overhead light, and then put it away in a drawer at home where it would not surprise me later. I washed my hands the way my grandmother taught me to do when coming back from work. I made tea and stood at the sink for a few minutes, counting the breath in and the breath out, letting my shoulders settle where they belonged. The strings from the ballroom were still in my head, not as a memory, but as a metronome. Tomorrow morning would be business hours. Business hours were when decisions like mine belonged. The apartment was the kind of quiet that lets your mind line up its tools. I set my purse on the entry table, washed my hands, and sat at the desk by the window, where the harbor lights blinked like patient metronomes. I opened my laptop and woke a folder with a name I had typed weeks ago when goodwill still seemed possible. Wedding_sponsor_Abigail. Inside were 8 letters of sponsorship, each signed, each separate, each with its own scope and ceiling. Venue and audiovisual. Catering. Band and production. Floral. Photographer and videographer. Room block. Transport. Honeymoon fund. The total was $81,000. A generous sum when you imagine a family stepping into a new season together. A clean lever when you imagine what to do after a brother treats you as disposable. Every letter carried the same little backbone near the end. A rescission clause written in plain language. Notice by email is effective upon acknowledgement during business hours. No drama, no ambiguity. I read each clause slowly, the way you read a prescription label before you swallow the pill. Then I pulled up my contacts and pressed call on the name I trust when numbers and obligations stand up straighter than feelings. Sandra Lopez answered with that level voice I have always admired. I told her what happened in terms that fit on an incident report. A name tag. An instruction to remove me. A staff member who did his job by the book. I told her I did not want to speak ill of anyone and that I did not want to claw back deposits. I wanted to rescind only from balances and any undisbursed sums. Sandra repeated it back the way good accountants do. Retainers already paid are non-refundable. You rescind from the balance forward. Notice by email becomes effective when the vendor confirms during business hours. She asked me to open each letter and confirm that the clause language matched between versions. It did. She asked about tone. Firm, factual, courteous. I told her that was the only tone I had left. We drafted a short addendum to travel with each notice so that no vendor would need to hunt for context. A single paragraph that stated the trigger for the clause as a hostile act, directed at a sponsor, and cited the relevant section number. Facts do not bruise when they bump into each other. They settle into place and make a floor you can walk on. I wrote the first email as a template. Thank you for your work and preparation. This is notice of rescission from the sponsorship portion identified in our agreement. Retainers already paid remain in place. From acknowledgement forward, the primary host assumes all balances due under the existing terms. I checked the addendum. I checked the file names. I CC'd Amanda Cole, the planner, and Elena Park, the venue manager, because sunlight makes administrative weeds die fast. Then I set the delivery for 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time. I did the same for the second notice and the third until my outbox held 8 small arrows, ready to fly in a straight line. In between drafts, I stood, stretched my back, and poured water. It is easy to forget you have a body when your mind is building scaffolding. I wrote down a list by hand so my eyes would land on ink instead of a screen. Venue and AV, catering, band, floral, photo and video, rooms, transport, honeymoon. I put a check mark beside each subject line scheduled. The harbor lights winked once, then again. Before I closed the laptop, I opened my calendar and blocked the first hour of the morning. No calls, no meetings, only confirmations and filing. If you do not make room for order chaos, we'll happily rent the room and invite friends. I went to the bedroom and opened the top drawer. The card sat where I had left it, white against dark wood. I did not need to read the word. I slid it beneath an old silk scarf and closed the drawer back to a quiet line. My phone went silent on the nightstand. Calm is not a denial of pain. It is a way to carry pain without spilling it on strangers. In bed, I lay on my side and watched the thin strip of harbor light along the blinds. I thought about paper that matches rules and clocks that match work. There is a kind of mercy in a world that still answers to both. I let my breath count itself. I told my shoulders they could let go now because the plan was written down and timed. When sleep came, it came like a drawer sliding shut. Precise, unremarkable, final enough for the night. Morning light reached across the harbor like a patient hand. I brewed coffee, opened my laptop, and let the screen settle on the outbox, where 8 scheduled messages waited like small, steady boats. At 8:30 in the morning, they sailed. 1 to the venue and audiovisual team, 1 to catering, 1 to band and production, 1 to floral, 1 to photographer and videographer, 1 to room block reservations, 1 to transport, 1 to the honeymoon fund administrator. Each carried the addendum Sandra and I had written. Each carried the same spine. Retainers remain. Rescission from the balance forward. Notice effective when acknowledged during business hours. I set my cup down and opened my calendar. The first hour was blocked for confirmations and filing. It is a comfort to give paperwork a clean runway. At 9:12, the first reply arrived. Amanda confirmed receipt per the clause, courteous and precise. The kind of planner who knows that clarity is a kindness. I logged the timestamp, saved the message to the folder, and felt my shoulders relax a notch. At 9:25, Elena replied from the Riverside Grand Hotel. Her email was the kind that solves 3 problems in 1 paragraph. From acknowledgement forward, the primary host, James Franklin, would be responsible for all balances due. Terms remained net 15 with a late fee of 3% if overdue. The memo copied the appropriate billing desk. It also confirmed that my rescission did not touch any deposits or retainers already applied. That sentence mattered more than I wanted to admit. It told me I was not punishing people for work already done. I was simply stepping off the remainder of a path that had been walked past me. I opened a fresh page and reviewed the sponsorship commitments, so my mind could see the math in one place. Venue and audiovisual at $25,000, catering at $12,000, band and production at $10,000, floral at $8,000, photographer and videographer at $4,000, room block at $6,000, transport at $4,000, honeymoon fund at $12,000. The total reads like a final chord, $81,000. A round number that had felt generous when I believed I would stand inside that ballroom as a sister. A clean lever now that I had been told to stand outside as an afterthought. Lisa arrived at my office door with her tablet and a quiet nod. She knows how to move inside a delicate morning. I asked her to compile the timestamps of each acknowledgement along with the addendum into a single file. She color-coded vendor names, pinned the file to the project header, and set a reminder to update the log as new confirmations came in. She did not ask for details I did not want to say out loud. She only said that the harbor looked beautiful from my window and that we had time held on the calendar to finish this properly. Practical grace is a gift you can give without touching anyone. By 10, my inbox had the rhythm of a metronome. A question from transport about which segments were covered by the rescission. Answered and filed. A brief note from the band lead, acknowledging the change and confirming that their retainer remained intact. Filed. A billing contact from the florist, requesting the primary host address. Forwarded to the planner and saved. There was no spike of triumph in any of it. Only the steadiness that comes when a plan is moving along the tracks it was built for. I leaned back and looked out at the water where small boats nosed toward the channel. Hurt likes to flare in the mind and make a case for noise. Order likes to take your hand and walk you through a morning without breaking stride. I had not disrupted a wedding night. I had not clawed back deposits from people who had already loaded vans and wrapped flowers and tuned instruments. I had withdrawn only from what I had the right to withdraw. That sentence sat in me like a level bubble in a carpenter's tool. Even, centered, true. When the clock reached the bottom of the hour, I saved the consolidated file one more time and closed the folder. The room felt different, not lighter but steadier. Somewhere down the corridor, a printer hummed. On my desk, the pen rested where I had left it, aligned with the edge of the pad. I took a slow breath, tasted coffee gone cool, and let the morning end on the right side of the ledger. I did not turn on the television. I did not call a friend to narrate the evening like a play-by-play. I took a pot from the lower cabinet and made a simple soup with carrots and chicken and the last of the dill. Steam rose in a quiet ribbon, and the apartment finally smelled like something I could name. After I ate, I rinsed the bowl and set it in the rack, then stood under a warm shower long enough for the heat to loosen the tightness along my neck. When I came out, I folded my robe the way my grandmother had taught me into a neat square that made order out of cloth. I set my phone to Do Not Disturb, placed it face down on the nightstand, and pulled the shades to a line that let in one calm strip of harbor light. The world on the other side of town could rise and fall without me. My job for the night was to keep still. Sleep came in clean pieces. If I woke, it was only to turn my pillow to the cool side and let the quiet take me again. Once around midnight, I surfaced and listened to the small sounds a home makes when it believes no one is taking notes. The refrigerator sighed. A pipe settled with a harmless tick. My own heartbeat steadied to the slow count I teach myself when thoughts try to sprint. I lay there and felt the ache in my ribs recede from sharp to ordinary, the way pain becomes a bruise you can protect by moving carefully instead of bracing hard. Somewhere across Stamford, a ballroom emptied out, trays were counted, linens bagged, vases gathered, and vans loaded. Somewhere a billing desk closed a shift report and set a stack of invoices to draft for the morning. None of it required my breath or my pulse. I had already decided which hours would hold my decisions, and those hours had names like bank open and office lights on. At 7:40 the next morning, I turned off Do Not Disturb. The screen filled at once. 100 missed calls, most from family numbers I knew by heart, and from the planner's business line, time stamped between 9 at night and 2 in the morning. A few from unknown numbers that would be vendors or relatives who had found my cell through someone who thought urgency justifies every trespass. I set the phone down and brewed coffee strong and dark the way I used to make it when I had newborn clients and deadlines that did not bend. The kitchen held its own weather. Warm mug, clean counter, a chair that did not ask questions. I opened the voicemail list and scrolled, without pressing play. There are messages you can hear without sound. A brother who starts angry and slides into pleading. A mother who wraps reproach in worry. A planner who tries to be neutral in a storm. A cousin who asks where I am because she has been told a story with my absence in it. I selected them all and saved them to a folder. I did not need the words now. I needed the record. Records are for the spine of a day. Reactions are for fires. I was not walking into a fire. At 8, the first finance emails began to arrive one after another in tidy subject lines. Account reconciliations, balance due notices, a request for primary billing contact, all during business hours as it should be. I read each one and watched the timestamps line up like fence posts on a property line. Some messages copied me as a courtesy. Some simply asked the host to confirm receipt, and I recognized variations of language I had read 100 times in my own contracts. The terms we had all agreed to were moving forward on their own legs. I answered nothing that did not require my reply. I forwarded what belonged to the planner. I filed what belonged to the record. I let the rest pass through like weather that knows the lay of the land better than I do. My mind wanted to run ahead and reconstruct the night to color in scenes I did not attend. It would have been easy to imagine band members waiting near the service doors, or a venue manager at a small desk reviewing a ledger under a lamp. But imagined scenes do not change a single line on an invoice. I brought my mind back to the coffee, to the list of receipts in my project folder, to the rhythm of my breath. Every few minutes I lifted the phone and looked at the notifications again. It is a human reflex hard to tame. The numbers did not tell me anything new. They only confirmed that I had stepped out of someone else's emergency. I took the card from its drawer, held it for a heartbeat, then put it back under the silk scarf. That word would not follow me into the day unless I carried it there. By 10, the business emails had found their pace and my inbox looked less like weather and more like a calendar. The apartment was as it had been the night before: a rinsed bowl, a clean counter, a robe folded on a chair. The refrigerator hummed its soft, even note. A gull called once outside and was gone. I sat at the table with my mug and let the quiet do its work again. I had chosen stillness when noise tried to conscript me. I had placed my actions inside the hours that honor paper and procedure. There is a kind of peace that comes when you let the world spin without reaching out to steady it. It is not indifference. It is respect for the difference between noise and orders. By noon the office had its weekday hum. Keyboards, a printer somewhere down the hall, Lisa's soft footfall as she set a folder at my elbow. The harbor lay steady outside the window, a sheet of light that kept my breathing honest. My desk phone lit with a New Jersey area code tied to a partner who takes diligence as seriously as I do. The associate on the line cleared her throat and said she was calling because their team had heard I caused a scene at a wedding over the weekend. She paused, ready for a defense or a confession. I gave her neither. I told her our firm does not handle private events, that my business was not in that ballroom, and that on a personal basis, I had been a parallel sponsor who rescinded under a clause after hostile treatment. My tone did the work my heart wanted to do. She asked what hostile meant in this context. I told her the facts that fit on one page. A name tag that called me an afterthought. A directive from the host party to remove me from the event area. A hotel security chief who followed 5-star protocol and documented the incident. Then I said the retainer portions of each sponsorship remained in place and that my notice applied only to balances going forward. I invited her to review the packet of confirmations already sent, including the planner's acknowledgement and the venue manager's letter assigning all balances to the primary host under net 15 terms with a 3% late fee if overdue. There was a small silence on her end, the kind you get when people sift emotion out of information. She asked for the subject lines she should search in her inbox. I listed them steady and slow, and told her that Lisa could forward the consolidated file with timestamps if that made their work easier. She said they would proceed with an internal review and circle back by the end of the week. I thanked her for calling directly instead of letting a rumor do the talking for both of us. When the line went quiet, I set the receiver down and let my hands rest flat on the desk. I could feel where the wood had warmed under my palms. Lisa stepped in with a glass of water and the kind of look that asks and does not pry. I told her the call went as it should, then asked her to send the consolidated file to the partner's diligence team with a short cover note. She nodded and moved like a good nurse in a busy ward, precise kind, unhurried. I opened my afternoon agenda and refused to let the day bend around a story that did not belong to my work. A client deck needed a final pass on numbers. A junior designer had 2 layouts that wanted a bolder headline. A vendor rebate needed coding to the correct account. The ordinary shape of labor has a way of rinsing the mind. Around 2 sunlight slanted across the conference room wall and turned everything a soft gold that reminded me of my mother's wedding band. I let the thought come and pass. Sentiment belongs in a safe box when you are balancing the books of your own dignity. A few texts blinked on my cell, then stilled. I did not answer. My silence was not a weapon. It was a boundary drawn at the edge of a desk where work pays for a life that no one gave me. The harbor kept its color. Printers kept their rhythm. My inbox is filled with the kinds of messages that build a career and empty of the kinds that try to bend it out of shape. By late afternoon, I had initiated the last page of the client deck and sent it forward. I stood stretched and looked at the skyline that could not care less who embarrassed whom in a ballroom. I thought about the difference between reputation and noise. Reputation is what remains when you let the document speak. Noise is what fades when you do not give it a microphone. I picked up my pen, aligned it with the edge of the pad, and turned to the next task. They arrived just after lunch, the receptionist calling up with that careful tone that says, "Family and business have decided to meet on the same rug." I asked Lisa to bring them to the glass conference room and to set a pitcher of water with 4 glasses. I carried in a slim stack of papers, the rescission letters, and the venue replies, and placed them in a tidy fan on the table. The Afterthought tag stayed where it belonged, zipped inside my purse, a private reminder, and not a prop. James came in first, shoulders squared, jaw set. My mother followed in a dress that said, "Proper afternoon," her pearls a small shield. My father took the chair nearest the door and studied the carpet the way men do when they want to be present and absent at the same time. I did not offer hugs. I offered seats and a clock. I said we had 30 minutes. I said we would use them well. For a breath I watched the second hand make its precise sweep and saw our faces doubled in the glass. There was my mother's profile composed as a portrait. There was my father's shoulder turned half away. There was my brother's chin set like a hinge that does not want to move. In the reflection I could also see my own hands steady on the folder, and I told them quietly to keep the tone I had chosen. Documents will do the heavy lifting if you let them. I began the way I begin difficult client meetings. Calm, factual, brief. Retainers remain. I have rescinded from the balances only. From acknowledgement forward, the primary host bears the remainder under net 15 terms and any penalty provisions stated in the agreements. I slid the venue manager's email across the table so that the words did not have to rely on my voice. My mother lifted the page, scanned it, and set it down as if it might smudge her fingers. James spoke first. He said vendors approached him during the reception, and after midnight that it was humiliating that I had blindsided him. I let the words sit for a count of 3, then answered in the same tone I use when a supplier misses a deadline and wants sympathy for traffic. Every host reconciles something on event night. It is not a scandal. It is a task. I reminded him that each retainer remained intact, and that my notices were sent and acknowledged during business hours the next morning. The timeline matters when you are tempted to rewrite the story in brighter ink. My mother leaned forward and asked me not to make a big deal. She said people talk that weddings are for unity, that families ought to be careful what they air in front of outsiders. I told her this was not a public airing. This was a ledger being balanced to the penny. Then I folded my hands and left the air still. Words do not always improve a silence that has already told the truth. My father said nothing. He kept his gaze on the glass wall where the harbor shone like a quiet fact. I have come to recognize the grammar of his silence. It was the same tense he used when I chose a career he could not diagram on a napkin. Present, but withholding. I felt a familiar ache, then let it pass. I have learned to set feelings on a side plate during meetings that decide the cost of things. James asked if I intended to pay anything further. I said no. I said I would not reinstate funding. I said all financial communication should go through the planner and the venue during business hours. I said this once and only once, because repetition invites negotiation, and there was nothing left to negotiate. The planner's acknowledgement and the venue letter made that plain. We sat through a minute where no one reached for the water. The room was bright, the kind of clear light that does not let you dodge your reflection in the glass. Somewhere, a HVAC vent sighed and settled. I gathered the papers, clipped them, and placed the packet at the center of the table for them to take. Lisa tapped lightly at the door and asked with her eyes if we needed anything. I shook my head. She understood and left us with the soft click of a practiced hand. I stood, thanked them for coming, and walked them back to the reception desk. No raised voices, no barbs. Only footsteps and the soft roll of the elevator doors opening. The clock on the wall read exactly 30 minutes. Precision can be a kindness when emotions want to run long. As the doors closed, I caught the conference room in the glass again, empty and orderly, and felt my shoulders settle a half-inch lower. The boundary had been spoken out loud, filed in writing, and held in time. The workday could return to being a workday. Back at my desk, the afternoon kept its office rhythm. The harbor was a sheet of patient light, the glass wall a quiet mirror. An email from Amanda landed at the top of my inbox with a subject line that did not breathe hard. She had pulled the print system metadata within her project permissions and attached a simple export. I opened the file and found an action entry that read like a single footstep on fresh snow. A manual overwrite to the badge name field at 2:14 in the afternoon. The initiating account was listed as Groom Party Guest Desk. The device location showed the check-in table just outside the ballroom doors. There was no private chat, no commentary, no gossip, only the technical trail a system keeps when humans touch it. Timestamp user account device tag action, recorded as overwrite. The new value matched the word that had sat in my palm in thick black type. Afterthought. I let my eyes rest on the line until it stopped burning and became simply data again. The timing mattered because the clause I had cited does not ask how a slight felt. It asks what happened when and by whose hand. A deliberate alteration to an identifying badge in the hour before guest flow qualifies as a hostile act directed at a sponsor under the plain language of those letters. Amanda's note said she could provide additional logs of the same type if the hotel requested them, and that all of it was standard audit material available to parties of record. I wrote her a short thank you in the same tone I use when a vendor ships on time. I told her the export was sufficient for my files and that I appreciated her keeping the scope strictly technical. Sunlight is best when it falls on facts, not people. I saved the attachment in the evidence folder and marked it with the event date so I would not have to think my way back to it later. A few minutes later, a message from Tyrone arrived with a scanned copy of the security report we had completed in the lounge. The language was precise. Guests identified by name. Escort initiated at the request of the host party. Escort conducted without incident from the lobby lounge to the front drive. The guest affirmed it was safe to depart on her own. Report signed and dated by head of security. Procedure is a kind of mercy when feelings are intent on turning feral. I saved the file alongside the metadata export and felt something in my chest unclench the way a knot loosens under warm water. Then my cousin Rachel texted that she had a handful of photos from the check-in area taken while she waited for her husband to park. I asked her to email them so I could file them properly. The images arrived in a small stack. In one, 2 bridesmaids leaned over the registration tablet with a staff member, the printer half visible on the edge of the frame. In another, the same trio glanced down at a white card as if proofreading a joke. The timestamps in the image data aligned with 2:15 hour, the same window as the system overwrite. No faces were centered, no one was named, but the sequence told its quiet story anyway. I laid the 3 pieces side by side on my screen. Technical log. Signed report. Candid photos. Each one clean to hold, free of rumor or malice, and together enough to draw a line you could follow without squinting. The line pointed to intent, and intent is what turns a misprint into tampering. It also satisfied the condition that triggered rescission under the agreements I had filed. Recognizing that made something in my shoulders drop a fraction, not triumph, only release the body understanding that a conclusion could finally sit down. I opened a fresh document and wrote a 2-paragraph memo to myself that summarized the chain, then saved it with the rest. I did not feel triumph. I felt aligned. I had not gone looking for anyone to punish. I had gone looking for the difference between a feeling and a fact. Outside the window, a sailboat cut a still path across the water, and a gull made a simple white shape against the blue. I closed the folder, placed my palms flat on the desk, and let the room be as steady as it wanted to be. The text came mid-afternoon, a number I recognized from the rehearsal dinner list, and a message short enough to feel careful. Olivia asked if I had time to meet for coffee near downtown Stamford. I looked at the harbor and then at my calendar. I told her I could set aside 45 minutes. Clear time limits make tender subjects easier to carry. The cafe sat on a corner where the trees give just enough shade to make the windows look like glass in a painting. Inside, the air smelled of espresso and baked citrus. I arrived first and chose a table near the window far enough from the bar to keep voices low. Olivia walked in a few minutes later, hair pulled back, no bridal gloss, only a simple sweater, and that look people wear when they are trying to hold two loyalties in the same pair of hands. She greeted me softly and we sat. A barista set down 2 cups. Olivia said she was grateful I had agreed to meet. She said the bride's side had been fielding whispers since the invoices began to land. Supplemental charges. Penalties no one had budgeted. She said she did not know what had happened with the name tag. She used the same words twice. I did not know the repetition, not for effect, but because sometimes the truth needs a second pass through the throat to feel solid. I listened. I kept my hands in my lap so that my face could do the work my hands wanted to do. She said the florist had sent a balance that surprised her mother, and the hotel had copied her on a message to James that referenced net 15 terms and a late fee. She said the planner was doing her best to keep things orderly, but the extended family had started their usual weather, the kind that builds from gossip and then calls itself concern. She looked at me the way a person glances at a shoreline to steady themselves. She asked if I would consider supplying an objective statement so the venue might consider the penalty. Not to absolve anyone, only to give the billing office a fuller record. I took a sip of coffee and thought about the folder on my desktop. I told her I could provide a procedural note that stated the facts as they appear in the documents. I said it would include the audit log showing the manual overwrite of my badge name and the security report documenting that an escort from the lounge was initiated at the host party's request. I said it would attach the planner's acknowledgement and the venue manager's letter that moved all balances forward to the primary host, and confirmed retainers remained in place. I said it would carry no personal commentary and no conclusions, only dates, times, and a list of exhibits. I promised to send it within 24 business hours. Olivia closed her eyes for a short moment. Relief does that in the muscles of the face. She thanked me for the clarity and said she understood the difference between a statement of fact and a plea. Then she asked the question that hangs between 2 women when money and family share a table. She asked whether I would consider reinstating any portion of my sponsorship to reduce the immediate strain. She said she was not asking out of entitlement, she was asking out of fear of being the kind of couple that begins a marriage with a stack of bills that belong to a bad story. I kept my voice as level as the harbor outside. I told her I would not reinstate any funding. I said it plainly because anything less would be a cruelty. I said my decision was not a punishment, it was a repair, and that repairs fail when you sand them down to make people more comfortable. I told her that the retainer portions of my sponsorship were still intact and would remain so, and that my note might help a billing office make a reasonable decision about penalties. I said I would do that part. I would not pay for the rest. She looked past me for a second toward the door and the ordinary street. Then she nodded. She said she did not come to change my no. She came to understand it. She said she had begun to see how a family can make a habit of calling dependency love. She said she did not want that habit in her home. There were tears, not dramatic, only clean. She dabbed them away with a napkin And then she smiled the way people smile when they realize they will not break even if other people think they should. We talked about logistics. I asked for the exact email address at the hotel that handles penalty reviews so my note would not wander. She gave me the planner's preferred subject line for supplemental documentation. She asked whether I wanted to include a line stating that I was safe to depart on my own as the report recorded. I said yes, that line matters because it tells the story of a night when strangers behaved better than family. We agreed on the 24-business-hour timeline. She asked if I would copy her so she could file the document with her own records. I said I would. Then we set the topic down like a tray. We spoke for a few minutes about ordinary things that belonged to two people who might have been friends if they had met in another season. She told me she grew up in New Haven and once saved for a year to buy a secondhand piano. I told her I learned to sew from my grandmother and that sometimes I still mend a hem by hand because it quiets the mind like a prayer whispered over a sink full of dishes. The cafe filled with the small hum of late afternoon. A couple at the next table argued softly about a paint color. A woman in a navy blazer read a brief and tapped the screen with her thumbnail. When we stood to leave, Olivia reached for her bag and then paused. She said she was sorry for the word on the card. She said no one should be made to wear a joke that hurts. She said she would find the courage to say that out loud where it mattered. I told her that courage is a muscle that grows when you use it to carry your own side of a load. I told her I hoped her marriage would be a place where truth can sit down without being asked to leave. Outside, the sun had softened at the edges, and the light along the street looked almost kind. We walked to the corner together. She turned left toward the garage. I turned right toward the harbor. There were no winners, no losers, only two women who had agreed on the line between respect and rescue. I felt the weight in my chest rearrange itself into something proportionate. At the curb, a car slowed for a pedestrian, and the day made space for a person to cross. The text from my father arrived just after lunch when the light off the harbor had turned a calmer blue. He asked to meet at Scalzi Park. I told him I could be there in 30 minutes. I put on a sweater and walking shoes, left my phone face down on the passenger seat, and drove the familiar streets that had carried me to piano recitals and dentist appointments when I was a girl who thought grown-ups owned all the answers. Scalzi Park was the same sane green it always is on a clear Connecticut afternoon. People walked dogs that seemed to know their own names. A pair of teenagers nudged a soccer ball back and forth with the patience of boys who still have time to spare. Down by the water, a father held the back of a bicycle seat while a small child pedaled in fierce concentration. I found my father on a wooden bench facing the pond. He did not stand when I approached, but he shifted so there was room. I sat. For a minute we watched a duck make slow chevrons across the surface and said nothing, because neither of us knew how to start without waking old ghosts. He began with a sentence about the weather. People do that when they are deciding whether to cross a difficult stream. He said the shade was good here, and that the air always moved at the pond, even on days when the town felt bright and tight. Then he spoke the way a man does when he has been rehearsing a line that refuses to sound like the speech he practiced. He said he had worried about appearances for so long that it had become a habit that felt like a virtue. He said he confused control with care, and that control eventually asks for interest on its own loan. He said on the wedding night he chose silence. He did not pretend that the choice had been noble. He said it was fear and something that pride does when it feels cornered. I let his words sit between us. My grandmother used to say that conversation is a table and not every sentence needs a chair. I told him I had heard what he said. I told him I believed that he believed it. I did not tell him I forgave him. Forgiveness is a word that belongs to deep water, and it was too early in the afternoon for swimming. I said that withdrawing my funding was a consequence of how I had been treated. I said it was also a choice to protect my peace going forward. I said peace cannot grow where contempt keeps its boots by the door. He nodded like the body does when truth fits, even if the heart wants another size. He asked whether I could reconsider. Not everything he said, just some part to help the edges of the bill that had landed when my rescission took effect. He said the house felt smaller since the wedding, and that his chest felt tight in the evening when the phone went quiet. He said he did not like the man he had been that night. He asked if there was a way to undo some small portion of the new reality so that he could sleep easier. I said no. I kept my voice even because evenness is a gift when you are saying a hard word to someone who once carried you to bed when you fell asleep on the couch. I said what had been withdrawn would not be restored. I said that decision was not a gesture I was making at him, it was a boundary I was placing around myself. I said I would not be the person a family calls when shame writes a check, it always meant someone else to cover. I said my no was final, and that a no can be loving when it protects the future from a pattern that wrecked the past. He looked at the pond as if the answer might be drifting there on the back of a leaf. A pair of runners passed behind us, and the whisper of their shoes on the path sounded like pages turning. He said he wanted to understand what continuing as a family could look like if money was no longer part of the conversation. He said he had always believed that family is a system of debts paid forward. He said he was beginning to see that family might be something less transactional and therefore more costly. He tried to smile, and it looked like a man testing a muscle he did not know he still had. I told him I was willing to talk in rooms that were not built on obligation. I told him that respect would have to be the first rule, and that if respect left the room, then I would leave with it. I said I would not repeat explanations about rescission retainers or penalties. Those belonged to a folder, and the folder told that story better than I needed to. I said I would be open to dinner sometimes. I said I would not be the emergency line when a bill arrived or a cousin complained. I said I would not play a part that required me to carry my own erasure. He said he heard me. He said he would need time to figure out what being a father looked like now that I had stopped auditioning for the daughter he thought he wanted. He said he was sorry for the girl he did not protect in a lobby filled with music she never got to hear properly. He said he could not promise that habit would not push him to take the safer opinion in a crowded room, but he could promise that he would not stay seated when decency asked him to stand. We sat another minute and watched the bicycle child make a wobbling circle and then straighten. A cheer rose from the small body, like a bird finally clearing a hedge. The father clapped once and then let go of the seat entirely. The bike kept moving. I felt something like that in my own ribs. The balance I needed did not require another hand. It required my own legs and my own breath set to a steady count. He asked about my work, and I told him we had signed a new client after a long diligence process. He said that was good, and that I had always been good with numbers even when I insisted on drawing during math class. The small talk felt like a polite bandage. It was not a cure. It kept the air clean so nothing would get in that should not. When he said he should be going, he stood and hesitated. He asked if he could hug me. I thought about it. Then I nodded and let him put his arms around my shoulders. It was a careful embrace, the kind you give when you are not sure which bones are still tender. When he let go, he said he would be in touch. He said he would try to bring respect to the table first and leave pride in the car. He started down the path, and I watched him go until the maples took him into a dapple of shadow. I stayed on the bench a while longer. The afternoon had deepened and the pond had turned a darker green. Somewhere nearby a grill had been lit, and the air held a thin line of wood smoke that reminded me of summers when the facts of a day were as simple as sun water and a plate of cut fruit. I breathed and counted the way I do when the mind wants to dart. On the walk back to my car, I felt a steadiness that had nothing to do with winning. Two people had said true things. One had asked for a reversal and received a no. We had both stood up anyway. If we spoke again, it would be because respect made the invitation. Money would not be the host. Monday began with a sky the color of paper before the first line. I brewed coffee, set my laptop on the kitchen table, and opened the inbox that had been quiet through the night like a well-trained dog. At 7:38, a new message appeared from the photographer Noah Patel. The subject identified the wedding by date and job number. Attached was a letter on his studio letterhead, signed and scanned. He confirmed the retainer received the remaining balance owed by the host and the delivery timetable for proofs. He also included a short paragraph noting that in every prior contract with my firm, I had conducted business in a professional and timely manner. It was not praise so much as an entry in a logbook. The tone carried the calm you hear on a clean audio track. I saved the letter to the evidence folder and sent a copy to Lisa with a note asking her to add it to the consolidated file. The cursor blinked, and then another message arrived, this one from the venue manager, Elena Park. She had written to both me and James, copying the planner and the billing office. Her email contained the details that matter when you want the noise to sit down. The balance due amount. The net 15 deadline counted from acknowledgement. The 3% late fee applied after the deadline. A summary of responsibilities for each party after a sponsor rescinds phrased so precisely it read like a well-tuned instrument. She included invoice numbers, a phone extension for billing questions, and a line confirming that retainer funds remained credited exactly as recorded. The message carried no heat, only clarity. I read it twice and felt my breathing lengthen. The process was working. The same words that had lived in contracts for years were standing up and doing their job in full daylight. I forwarded the message to Lisa with the subject line that let our system route it into the right pocket. Then I stood and rinsed my cup. Outside the harbor had turned the soft blue that usually waits until mid-morning. It looked like a promise that someone would keep. At 8:15, the diligence team from New Jersey sent an internal memo addressed to my company and copied to procurement. The memo stated that they had completed their review of the materials we provided regarding the rescission and that those materials were satisfactory. They had also verified through independent confirmations that the balances belonged to the host and that my actions had been within the scope of the clauses cited. The memo then moved in a clean line to the part that feeds a payroll. They were approved to proceed to contract execution on the project we had scoped over the past quarter. A link followed to their portal for e-signatures. I carried the laptop into my office, set it on the desk by the window, and asked Lisa to step in. We reviewed the portal packet together. Master Services Agreement, Statement of Work, Insurance Certificate Upload, W-9 Confirmation, Outside Counsel's rider that always read like a stern aunt who wears good perfume. We moved through each page initials, where initials belonged, signatures where signatures belonged, and a final submit that clicked with a sound as small and final as a latch on a jewelry box. Procurement sent a system notice with our new vendor number. Accounts Payable sent a second notice that a wire template would be created after the first invoice hit their queue. The chain was tidy and unremarkable. In a world that had spent a week trying to bend words into shapes they did not fit, this was grace. Noah called mid-morning and left a short voicemail that I listened to once. He said his letter spoke for itself, and that he preferred to let documents do the work people sometimes drag their voices into doing. I sent him a thank you by email and included a note that we would be in touch on an unrelated corporate shoot next month because business should be allowed to be boring again. Elena sent a second message around the same time attaching a statement of rights and obligations for sponsors and hosts that the hotel provides on request. She asked me to file it for my records and noted that the billing office had confirmed receipt by the primary host. The phrasing was so even it could have balanced a pencil. Before lunch, I gathered the team for 10 minutes in the conference room where the light tends to fall in a way that makes everyone look a little kinder. I told them the New Jersey partner had completed approvals and signed. I thanked Lisa for the running point on the file and for treating paperwork like the spine of the day. I thanked the designers for keeping deliverables on schedule, while the rumor mill tried to throw gravel in our gears. There was no cheering. There were a few smiles and the quiet shift in posture that followed relief. We went back to our desks, and the office resumed the sounds of paying the rent. Throughout the afternoon, I answered 2 small questions from procurement about invoice formatting and tax treatment for travel reimbursement. Then I drafted a brief note to Amanda and Elena, expressing appreciation for their clarity. I did not mention the wedding. I did not mention the name tag. I thanked them for prompt factual communication and closed with the kind of signature that signals the conversation is filed under professional rather than personal. They both responded with one-line acknowledgments that told me we were all ready to let the system do its job without narrative embroidery. Between tasks, I thought about the relief that arrives when third parties verify what you already know. It is not satisfaction that glows. The temperature is returning to normal. My grandmother used to cool cakes on a rack so the air could reach every side at once and the center would not sink. Verification feels like that air moving where heat had been trapped structure holding because it was baked long enough to be real. Late in the day, the New Jersey associate sent a final note that the signature packet had been countersigned by their general counsel. She attached the fully executed PDF and a cover sheet with a schedule for the first milestone review. I printed the first page because holding paper can remind the body that a thing exists outside the mind. Then I filed the document in the project directory, where it would live among other files that had earned their place without gossip. The harbor darkened by degrees, until it reached the color of a suit worn to a good meeting. I closed the blinds to a line that keeps the room steady, and shut the laptop with the small pleasure a clean click gives. I felt gratitude for people who do their jobs with decency, and for systems that stay put when emotions try to climb over them. The day had begun with letters and ended with a contract. Not a victory dance, a straight path. The message from Amanda arrived just after 9, a calm note with one attachment and 3 lines of context. Within her project permissions, she had pulled an additional audit entry from the badge system. The record showed approval of the tag change by a groom party account at the auxiliary check-in station at 2:14 in the afternoon. The device ID matched the small printer stationed beside the registration tablet. The time aligned to the minute with the earlier overwrite entry and with Tyrone's incident report timestamped from the lounge. Amanda's language stayed strictly technical, and I felt a small current of gratitude for people who know how to leave gossip at the door. I printed the metadata page and the security report, slid them into a thin folder, and checked my calendar. I did not want this conversation in my office. Work is a structure I have built with both hands, and I will not let it carry the weight of my family's unfinished business. I texted James and asked him to meet at the cafe near my building, the one with the high windows and the steady hum that turns private sentences into harmless air. He agreed to a time in the late afternoon. I walked over early and chose a table in the back, away from the register and the casual audience of people who pretend not to listen. I ordered water. It felt important that this not be softened by the ritual of coffee. When James came in, he looked like a man who had slept poorly for a week. The tuxedo brow of the wedding had given way to the ordinary lines of a long day. He sat. He did not reach for my hands, and I did not offer them. I said I wanted to keep this brief and factual. Then I set the first page in front of him. The audit entry from the badge system. A tag change approved by a groom party account at the auxiliary check-in station at 2:14 in the afternoon. He read the lines without touching the paper, his eyes moving left to right like a person reciting a prayer he had stopped believing in. I set the second page beside the first. Tyrone's report. Escort initiated at the request of the host party. Escort conducted without incident. Guest affirmed it was safe to depart on her own. The 2 times sat there like bookends that had been waiting for the right shelf. James said nothing for a while. It was not the theatrical silence of a man trying to gain leverage. It was the silence of someone measuring how far his words would fall if he let them out. Then he spoke. He said he had approved a prank. He called it memorable, the word he had used with the groomsmen when he wanted them to believe they were making the night sparkle. He said a bridesmaid had suggested it at the check-in table, that it would be a laugh, a small nudge at the sister who always insists on neatness and rules. He said he thought it was harmless. He said he did not think. He said finally that he wanted the room to love him and that sometimes love looks like making sure someone else stands slightly in the dark. I let the words rest in the air. You learn a lot by how a person names his own harm. I told him I was not here to grade his confession. I was here to state the only terms under which I would reopen a family dialogue that is more than weather and holiday photos. I unfolded a single sheet I had written in my own hand so I would not be tempted to improvise. He would pay the full balance and any penalties on time. He would send specific written apologies to the planner, to the venue, and to each vendor whose work had been dragged into his pride. He would send a separate apology to Olivia, not a line of regret wrapped in justification. A plain apology that names the act and its consequence. And he would stop using me as a prop for his pride. No more stories that require me to shrink so he can stand taller. No more jokes that spend my dignity like cheap change. He looked up as if checking whether the ceiling would hold if he agreed to stand under something heavier than he was used to. He asked if wiring the funds within the week met the condition. He asked if sending the letters the next day met the condition. I said yes. I said deadlines teach the body what a promise weighs. He nodded. The movement was small, but it was not a performance. It looked like a person realizing that the cost of his charm had come due. I did not speak for a moment. I wanted to be sure my voice would not drift towards sermon. Then I said that I would not be reading his letters before he sent them. He needed to do that labor with his own mind and his own hands. I said that I did not require copies. If he needed to prove he had kept his word, the billing office and the inboxes of the people he had harmed would be proof enough. He nodded again and made a note on his phone, his thumb moving slowly as if each word had to be earned. He asked whether this meant we would be a family again. The question came out thin the way questions do when they have lost the certainty that made them arrogant. I said I did not know what it meant. I said that if he met the terms, then the door to conversation would be open. But I said I would not pretend the house behind that door was the same one we grew up in. It cannot be. The walls were built too close to my ribs. They had to be moved. For a minute we sat with the sounds of the cafe making an ordinary privacy around us. A woman laughed at something on her screen. A grinder started and stopped. Someone said the word caramel like it mattered. I reached into my purse and felt the small rectangle of cards that had taught me more in one night than my childhood had managed in years. I took it out. Set it flat on the table for a single heartbeat and looked at it. Like you look at a mile marker you do not need any more. Then I slid it back into the lining pocket and zipped the purse shut. I do not need a weapon. I have a boundary. James said he understood. I did not ask if he truly did. Understanding is a tree you plant and water and wait on. The proof is shade, not talk. He stood and said he would go to the bank that afternoon to arrange the wire. He said he would write the letters tonight, and he named the people out loud so I would hear him take ownership. Planner, venue, vendors, Olivia. He looked down at his hands. He said he was sorry. He did not ask me to say anything back. We left through the door that lets you see the harbor if you turn your head. The light had gone from bright to useful, the hour that asks you to finish what you started before the day pins itself closed. At the curb, he turned left toward the bank. I turned right toward my building. My steps felt level. In the pocket of my purse, the card lay still and unimportant. Some objects lose their power when you stop feeding them with your attention. Back at my desk, I filed the printed pages and typed a one-line note to myself. Meeting with James. Terms stated. Promises timed. Do not chase. Then I closed the folder and opened the work that pays the bills that belong to my own life. A contract review. A set of proofs waiting for approval. The reliable machinery of a day that has decided it will not turn itself into a story just to please a person who needs a stage. 2 months later, I walked up a short flight of stairs to a brick building near downtown Stamford where my parents had rented a smaller place with a view of a parking lot and a strip of sky. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the kind of cooking that lives in old walls. My mother had set a table for 4 with a white cloth that had seen better holidays. A casserole steamed beside a simple salad, and a store cake waited on the counter with its plastic lid still on. We sat without ceremony. The living room lamps cast a soft light on faces that had learned something about themselves in a season none of us had planned. James cleared his throat and said he had paid the balance and the penalties on time. He slid a folded confirmation page across the table and said the wire receipts were in his email if anyone needed them. He added that the letters had been sent to the planner, the venue, each vendor, and to Olivia, and that he had written them himself without asking anyone to clean up his words. I nodded and let the paper rest untouched. Proof is not always for the person who was wronged. Sometimes it is for the person who needs to feel the weight of making it right. Olivia arrived a few minutes late with a small bouquet of grocery store tulips. She set them in a glass of water and took a seat beside James. She said she had received his apology and that it named the act and the harm without excuse. She said she was grateful to see the truth set down where it belonged. Her voice carried the steadiness of someone who had decided to build a marriage with solid boards and simple nails. My mother folded and refolded her napkin. She said she had spent years afraid of being diminished in front of friends who keep score by the wrong measures. She said envy had done its small, steady work inside her, and that she had let that work add up until it had a voice. She said she was sorry for every time she praised the children who fit the story she liked to tell, and looked away from the one who did not. She promised that her house would no longer run on shame. She kept her eyes on the table while she spoke. When she finished, she looked up and her face had the bare look of honesty that no one enjoys and everyone recognizes. My father pressed his palms flat on the table. He said his silence that night was wrong. He said he had sold decency for comfort, and that the exchange had soured the taste of the evening in his mouth. He said he would not repeat that choice. He did not ask me to say it was fine. He did not decorate his apology. He set it down like a tool and stepped back. I told them I was glad to sit at a table where words were finally carrying their full weight. I also said the funds I had withdrawn would not be reinstated. I said that if we continued to meet as a family, it would be because respect asked us to, not because someone needed something. I reminded them that my silence during the storm had been a boundary, not a weapon, and that I intended to keep it sharp and clean. We ate. The food tasted like ordinary life, which is to say, it tasted like a future you can manage. Conversation went to gentler subjects. A neighbor who feeds strays a leak under the sink that had been fixed, a recipe my grandmother used to make that we never wrote down properly. Very little was said about the wedding or the weeks after. What needed to be said had been said already. The rest belonged to the past, and the past does not get to keep pulling out chairs at the present table. When the cake was cut, my mother wrapped 2 slices for me to take home the way she used to wrap leftovers on weeknights when I was in high school and working late at the library. James asked whether we might set dinner every few weeks, nothing formal, just a penciled line that could be erased if respect had a conflict. I said that sounded right. Olivia told me she had started piano lessons again and that practicing made her feel like she was building new muscle under the skin of her life. I told her I had pulled out my grandmother's sewing kit and mended 2 hems, and that the small work had steadied my mind in ways big victories never managed to. When I stood to leave, the room felt lighter, not because anyone had been absolved, but because accountability had finally taken a seat. At the door, my father hugged me briefly, the careful kind of embrace that says, he understands he is holding something that is his, and also not his. My mother touched my cheek with her fingertips, almost a blessing, almost a truce. In the hall, I could hear someone down the corridor laughing at a sitcom. The building settled the way old buildings do when the evening cools and the day lets go. I walked out into a night that smelled like rain, deciding whether to fall. The air felt clean in my chest. I drove past the hotel without slowing and turned toward Harbor Point, where the water keeps its own counsel. The card in my drawer at home would stay where it was, a mile marker I no longer needed to touch. The loop had closed. Justice had done its quiet math. What remained was a version of family that might be small but could be honest. If you have ever had to set a financial line or an emotional line with the people who raised you or the people you love, tell me your story. Your hard yes and hard no might help someone else sleep through the night and wake up with a steadier heart.